Jake Turner wiped down his barber chair and glanced at the clock. It was almost closing time on Station Tertius 9, and the evening shift was winding down. His little barbershop sat tucked between a noodle bar and a repair shop, nothing fancy, just a clean place where people could get a decent haircut and maybe chat for a while. Jake liked it that way. Simple. Honest work. The station itself was a massive trading hub floating in deep space, where humans rubbed shoulders with dozens of alien species every single day. You'd see tall blue-skinned merchants haggling with short furry traders, military personnel from 100 different worlds grabbing food from the same vendors. It was chaotic and beautiful and sometimes overwhelming, but Jake had made his peace with it. He cut hair, played his guitar during slow hours, and tried not to get caught up in the drama that came with living on such a busy station. He was sweeping up the last bits of hair from his final customer when his shop door burst open with enough force to make the bell above it ring violently. Jake looked up, startled. A figure in a dark hooded cloak rushed inside, moving with desperate urgency. They were clutching something wrapped in shimmering silk cloth, holding it close to their chest like it was the most precious thing in the universe. The stranger's hands were shaking. Jake could see that much even from across the small shop. Before he could ask what was wrong, the figure spoke in broken, heavily accented English. Their voice was female, he thought, though the translator device on her collar kept glitching, making some words sound garbled and strange. She needed help. Desperately. The creature she was carrying, she explained in fragmented sentences, was sick. Not physically sick, but mentally distressed. Separation anxiety, she called it. The medical bay on the station was completely overwhelmed right now with some kind of quarantine situation. A disease had broken out in the lower sectors, and all the doctors were dealing with that emergency. Nobody had time for what they'd consider a minor problem. Jake stepped closer, curious despite himself. The woman pulled back a corner of the silk wrapping, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a baby dragon. An actual, honest-to-God dragon, no bigger than a house cat. Its scales shimmered like opals, catching the light in rainbow patterns. But what struck Jake most were its eyes. They were large and crystalline, filled with pure terror. The little creature was trembling uncontrollably, its tiny body shaking so hard that Jake worried it might hurt itself. As he watched, the dragon hatchling let out a sound that broke his heart. It wasn't quite a cry and wasn't quite a whimper. It was something in between, a keening noise that spoke of deep distress and fear. The baby kept making these sounds over and over, each one seeming more desperate than the last. Its small wings, translucent and delicate, fluttered weakly against the silk wrapping. The woman explained further, her words tumbling out in a rush. The hatchling wouldn't eat. Wouldn't sleep. Just kept crying and shaking. She'd tried everything. Nothing worked. She'd brought the baby here because she'd heard, through the station gossip network, that the human barber was kind. That he never turned anyone away, no matter how strange their request. Jake stood there, looking at this terrified baby dragon, and something in his chest tightened. He'd always been like this, even as a kid back on Earth. Couldn't stand seeing anything suffer. Stray dogs, injured birds, even the weird alien pets his neighbors kept. If something was hurting, Jake wanted to help. But what could he do? He was a barber, not a veterinarian. He didn't know the first thing about dragon biology or psychology. He opened his mouth to say as much, to explain that maybe she should try the medical bay again or find someone more qualified. Then his eyes landed on his guitar. It was an old acoustic his grandfather had given him years ago, beaten up and worn but still producing the sweetest sounds. Jake had learned to play as a teenager, and he'd brought the guitar with him when he'd moved to the station 5 years back. During slow periods, he'd sit in his barber chair and play, just simple melodies and folk songs his grandmother used to sing. Some of his customers said it made the shop feel peaceful. Calming. Without really thinking about it, Jake walked over and picked up the guitar. He settled into his barber chair, adjusting the instrument across his lap. The hooded woman watched him with confusion, clearly not understanding what he was doing. Jake didn't explain. He just started playing. His fingers found the strings almost automatically, and he began a soft, meandering melody. Nothing fancy, just a simple progression of chords that flowed into each other like water. It was a lullaby his grandmother used to play, slow and gentle and endlessly patient. The effect was immediate and almost magical. The baby dragon stopped trembling. Just like that, as if someone had flipped a switch. Its crystalline eyes, which had been darting around in panic, suddenly focused entirely on Jake's fingers as they moved across the guitar strings. The keening sounds ceased. The little creature's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow and deepen. Jake kept playing, hardly daring to breathe himself. He watched as the dragon's tiny head tilted to one side, studying his hands with intense concentration. Then, incredibly, the hatchling made a new sound. Not a cry of distress, but a soft chirping noise that seemed to match the melody Jake was playing. It was trying to sing along. The hooded woman made a sound of pure shock. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. Jake glanced at her briefly, then back at the dragon. He kept the melody going, gentle and consistent, and slowly stood up from his chair. Moving carefully, telegraphing every motion so as not to startle the creature, he walked closer. The dragon watched him approach but didn't panic. If anything, it seemed drawn to him. When Jake was close enough, he slowly reached out one hand. The hatchling sniffed his fingers, then, moving with surprising quickness, it squirmed out of the silk wrapping and climbed right into Jake's lap as he sat back down. Within 5 minutes of Jake starting to play, the baby dragon was curled up against his chest, breathing deeply and peacefully. Its small body had gone completely relaxed. Occasionally it would make that chirping sound again, hitting notes that somehow harmonized with Jake's guitar chords. Its eyes began to droop, exhaustion finally overtaking the anxiety that had been keeping it awake. Jake looked up at the hooded woman, uncertain what to do next. She was staring at him and the dragon with an expression he couldn't quite read. Wonder, maybe. Or fear. Possibly both. Before he could ask any questions, she suddenly spoke rapidly in her own language, the translator struggling to keep up. Something about being grateful, about returning soon, about this being more important than he could possibly understand. Then she turned and rushed out of the shop just as quickly as she'd entered, the door slamming shut behind her. The bell rang once more, then silence fell over the barbershop. Jake sat there, guitar still in his hands, with a sleeping baby dragon curled up in his lap, and absolutely no idea what he'd just gotten himself into. The first night with the dragon was absolutely insane. Jake had no idea what baby dragons ate, how often they needed to sleep, or even if they needed water. He tried searching the station's database, but there were literally thousands of dragon species catalogued across known space, each with different needs and behaviors. Without knowing exactly what type this little one was, he was basically flying blind. He decided to call the dragon Melody, because of the way it hummed along to his guitar. It seemed fitting somehow, and he needed to call it something other than the dragon or little one all the time. That first evening, Jake tried everything to get Melody to eat. He had some dried meat in his mini fridge, some fruit, even some of the weird crystalline nutrient bars the station sold for exotic pets. Melody wouldn't touch any of it. She just looked at the food, then looked back at Jake with those big crystalline eyes, and made a sad little chirping sound. Jake was getting worried. Really worried. Baby creatures needed food, didn't they? He'd heard stories about hatchlings dying if they didn't eat within the first few days. His mind was racing through options when he absently picked up his guitar again, more out of nervous habit than anything else. He started strumming a simple tune, not really thinking about it. Melody's head perked up immediately. She started making that happy chirping sound again, swaying slightly to the rhythm. And then, just like that, she walked over to the dried meat Jake had set out and started eating. She wouldn't take a single bite without the music playing, but as long as Jake kept strumming, she ate contentedly. It was the strangest thing he'd ever seen. But hey, whatever worked, right? The days started blending together after that. Jake would open his barbershop in the morning, and Melody would curl up in a sunny spot near the window, watching him work. His regular customers were shocked at first, seeing a baby dragon lounging in the corner like an oversized cat. But Melody was so small and cute that most people got over their surprise pretty quickly. Some even started bringing friends just to see the barber with the pet dragon. Jake kept expecting the hooded woman to come back. Every time his door opened, he'd look up hopefully, thinking maybe this was when he'd finally get some answers. But she never showed. Days turned into a week, and Jake started to realize he might be stuck with Melody for a while. The thought didn't upset him as much as it probably should have. The little dragon was growing on him fast. Melody was smart, too. Scary smart. Within a few days, she'd figured out Jake's entire routine. She knew when he was about to close up shop, when he was going to eat lunch, even when he was feeling stressed. If Jake seemed tense, Melody would nuzzle against his leg until he picked up the guitar and played for a while. It was like having the world's most intuitive emotional support animal. But while Jake was busy adjusting to life with a baby dragon, the station around him was changing in ways he didn't fully understand. His customers started acting strange. They'd come in for haircuts but seemed distracted, constantly checking their communicators. The conversations in his shop shifted from casual gossip to nervous whispers about increased security patrols and mysterious diplomatic arrivals. Jake caught bits and pieces of information. Something big was happening on Tertius 9. Really big. High-ranking officials from various governments were arriving unannounced. The station administrator had called some kind of emergency council meeting. Most alarming of all, there were warships taking up positions around the station. Not just any warships either. These were massive vessels from the Dragon Empire, a civilization so powerful that most humans only knew about them from history documentaries and news broadcasts. The Dragon Empire controlled over 400 star systems. They were ancient, wealthy, and notoriously protective of their interests. For them to send a military fleet to a simple trading station was unprecedented. People were scared, though they tried not to show it. Jake heard all this, but honestly, he didn't pay much attention. Station politics wasn't his thing. He figured whatever was happening with the Dragon Empire had nothing to do with him. He was just a barber trying to make a living and take care of an abandoned baby dragon. Why would he be involved in some big interstellar incident? What Jake didn't notice were the small, strange things happening around his shop. When station security teams did their routine patrols through his sector, their scanning equipment would fritz out near his door. Officers would approach his barbershop, then suddenly decide they needed to check somewhere else first. They'd walk right past, as if the building didn't exist. Delivery people started having trouble finding his address. They'd walk up and down the street, looking confused, even though Jake's shop had been in the same spot for 5 years. Some of his regular customers mentioned feeling a weird compulsion to skip their appointments, like they'd forgotten why they were coming to this part of the station. Jake attributed all of this to coincidence. Equipment malfunctioned all the time on space stations. People forgot appointments. No big deal. What he didn't realize was that Melody was causing all of it. The baby dragon had developed a protective instinct toward Jake, and with that instinct came power she couldn't fully control. A shimmering field of energy surrounded Jake's barbershop, invisible to the naked eye but incredibly powerful. It made people want to look away. Made scanning equipment fail. Made the shop practically invisible to anyone who wasn't determined to find it. Melody had created a shield without even knowing she was doing it, an instinctive defense mechanism to protect the person who'd shown her kindness when she was terrified and alone. By the end of the second week, Melody had grown noticeably larger. She was now the size of a medium dog, though still lanky and awkward like a puppy. Her scales had gotten brighter too, the opal coloring more pronounced. She'd started breathing tiny puffs of flame, though they were more like rainbow-colored sparks than anything dangerous. The first time it happened, Jake had panicked and grabbed a fire extinguisher. Melody had looked so offended that Jake actually felt bad and apologized to her. She'd taken to riding on his shoulders while he worked, curled around his neck like a scaly scarf. Customers thought it was hilarious. Jake just found it comforting. It was nice having company in the shop, even if that company was a dragon who insisted on humming along whenever he played guitar. The station lockdown came suddenly. One morning, Jake woke up to find armed guards on every corner and security checkpoints blocking major corridors. An announcement played over the station's intercom system, explaining that due to ongoing security concerns, no ships would be allowed to leave Tertius 9 until further notice. All residents were required to carry identification at all times and submit to random searches. Jake's customers that day were absolutely terrified. They came in whispering about the Dragon Empire's ultimatum, though Jake didn't really understand what they were talking about. Something about a missing heir. Something about the Empress threatening to destroy the station if her demands weren't met. The timeline kept getting shorter. First it was 72 hours. Then 48. Now people were saying they only had a day left before something terrible happened. Jake listened to all this while cutting hair, Melody dozing on his shoulder, occasionally breathing little rainbow sparks that smelled like cinnamon and starlight. He felt bad for everyone who was scared, but he still didn't see how any of it connected to him. He was just a barber with a baby dragon. Whatever political crisis was unfolding, it was way above his pay grade. He'd keep his head down, take care of Melody, and wait for things to blow over. He had no idea that he was holding the exact thing everyone was searching for, that the innocent creature sleeping on his shoulder was the reason an entire empire was ready to go to war. The announcement came through every speaker on the station at exactly noon. Jake was in the middle of giving a trim to an elderly alien who'd been coming to his shop for years when the voice echoed through the corridors, cold and official and carrying the weight of absolute authority. The Dragon Empire had issued a final ultimatum. They wanted the royal heir returned within 48 hours, or Tertius 9 would face consequences. The announcement didn't specify what those consequences would be, but it didn't need to. Everyone knew what happened when the Dragon Empire made threats. Systems burned. Planets went dark. Entire civilizations learned very quickly not to cross them. Jake's customer started shaking so badly that Jake had to stop cutting. The old alien's voice trembled as he explained what was happening. Somewhere on this station, someone had the missing dragon princess. The daughter of Empress Victoria the Eternal, the single most powerful ruler in 400 star systems. And whoever had taken her was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, because the Empress was tearing through space looking for her child, leaving destruction in her wake. Jake felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, but he pushed it away. Melody was just a baby dragon someone had abandoned. She couldn't possibly be royalty. That would be insane. Besides, she didn't act like a princess. She acted like a regular baby who liked music and sleeping in sunny spots and occasionally setting small things on fire by accident. But as the day wore on, Jake couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. His customers were absolutely terrified. Some were crying. Others were angry, demanding that the station administrator find whoever had the heir and turn them over immediately. A few talked about trying to steal a ship and escape, lockdown be damned. The fear in the air was thick enough to taste. The station administrator appeared on every screen that evening, looking haggard and desperate. He explained that enforcement teams were conducting systematic searches of every single residence, shop, and storage unit on Tertius 9. Nobody would be exempt. They'd search every corridor, every hidden corner, every possible hiding spot. The heir had to be found. The alternative was unthinkable. Jake watched the announcement with Melody curled in his lap. She'd gotten even bigger over the past few days, now roughly the size of a large dog. Her scales caught the light from his small television screen, creating rainbow patterns on his walls. She was purring, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through his chest. It was one of her new behaviors, something she did when she felt safe and content. The enforcement team started their searches that night. Jake could hear them going door to door, the sounds of furniture being moved and voices demanding cooperation. His neighbors were searched one by one. The noodle bar next door. The repair shop on the other side. Every business on his street got visited by stern-faced officers with scanning equipment and legal authority to tear places apart if necessary. But they never came to Jake's shop. It was the strangest thing. He'd watch through his window as the enforcement team would approach his section of the corridor. They'd be moving methodically, checking every single door. But when they got close to his barbershop, they'd just keep walking. Sometimes they'd slow down, looking confused, like they'd forgotten what they were doing. Then they'd shake their heads and move on to the next building, completely skipping his place. This happened 3 times over the course of 2 days. 3 different teams, all doing the same thing. Walking right past his shop like it didn't exist. Jake started to notice other weird things too. When he'd step outside to grab food, people wouldn't seem to see him clearly. They'd look right at him and Melody, then their eyes would slide away, like they couldn't quite focus. His communicator stopped receiving calls from the station's central system. Mail stopped being delivered to his address. It was like his barbershop was being erased from reality, bit by bit. Melody seemed completely unbothered by all of this. If anything, she seemed protective. Whenever someone approached the shop with aggressive energy or fearful intentions, a faint shimmer would appear in the air around the building. Jake had started seeing it out of the corner of his eye, like heat waves on a summer day, but when he looked directly at it, there was nothing there. Meanwhile, in orbit above the station, the situation was getting worse. More warships arrived every day. The Dragon Empire's fleet had grown to over 50 vessels, each one capable of reducing Tertius 9 to atoms. They hung in space like a noose, tightening slowly, waiting for the deadline to expire. And at the center of that fleet was the Empress herself. Jake's customers who still managed to find his shop told him stories about her. Empress Victoria the Eternal had ruled for over 3,000 years. She'd conquered civilizations, negotiated treaties that shaped galactic politics, and commanded loyalty from billions. But she was also a mother, and right now, she was a mother whose child had been taken. The reports coming from her flagship were terrifying. She'd stopped holding diplomatic meetings. Stopped negotiating. She simply issued demands and watched the clock count down. Her advisors were too scared to approach her. Her military commanders carried out orders without question, knowing that any hesitation might result in their own deaths. One of Jake's customers, a trader who dealt with the Dragon Empire before, explained it in simple terms. Dragons didn't love the way humans did. They loved deeper, fiercer, with an intensity that could reshape reality. When a dragon bonded with someone, that bond was forever. When a dragon lost someone they loved, the grief could literally tear worlds apart. And when someone took a dragon's child, the rage was biblical. The Empress had already destroyed 2 pirate outposts suspected of involvement. She'd interrogated hundreds of people, some of whom didn't survive the questioning. She'd offered rewards big enough to buy entire planets for information leading to her daughter's return. And now she was here, surrounding Tertius 9, giving them one last chance to return what was hers before she demonstrated exactly why her empire had lasted for millennia. The deadline was now 12 hours away. Jake sat in his barbershop that final evening, Melody sleeping peacefully on the chair next to him. He'd closed early because nobody was coming for haircuts anymore. Everyone was either hiding in their homes, praying the heir would be found, or desperately trying to find escape routes off the station. He picked up his guitar and started playing. It was something soft and melancholy, a tune his grandfather used to play when storms rolled across their farm back on Earth. Melody stirred, opened one eye, and started humming along. Her voice had gotten deeper as she'd grown, more resonant. The sound filled his small shop with warmth. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and felt his stomach drop. Her scales had that distinctive opal coloring. She was growing faster than any normal animal should. She had abilities that seemed almost magical. And she'd been brought to him by someone desperate, someone who'd disappeared without explanation. The pieces were falling into place in his mind, forming a picture he desperately didn't want to see. But before he could process what it all meant, before he could decide what to do with his growing suspicions, his shop door suddenly burst open. A young woman stood there, breathing hard, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and determination. She stared at Jake, then at Melody, and her face went completely white. Jake had no idea who she was or why she looked like she'd just seen the end of the world. But he was about to find out that his simple life as a barber was over, and that the sleeping dragon beside him was about to change everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the universe. The woman in the doorway looked like she'd been through hell. Her official diplomatic uniform was wrinkled and stained with sweat. Her hair had come loose from whatever neat style she'd probably started the day with, and her hands were shaking. But what really caught Jake's attention were her eyes. They held the kind of fear that comes from knowing too much, from understanding exactly how bad things could get. Her name was Lisa Hayes, and she was a junior diplomat assigned to Tertius 9. She'd been working non-stop for 3 days, part of the team desperately trying to locate the missing heir before the Empress made good on her threats. Lisa had used every resource available, called in every favor, analyzed every piece of data they had. And finally, after cross-referencing scanning anomalies and equipment failures, she traced everything back to this one sector. To this one barbershop that somehow every search team had missed. She'd had to physically force herself to keep walking toward the shop. Her body had wanted to turn around, to go somewhere else, anywhere else. It was like fighting through an invisible wall of pure compulsion. But she'd pushed through, driven by the knowledge that 40 million people lived on this station, and all of them would die if she failed. Now she stood in the doorway, staring at the most terrifying sight she'd ever seen. A human man sitting casually in a barber chair, holding a guitar. And next to him, sleeping peacefully without a care in the world, was the heir primaries of the Dragon Empire. The daughter of Empress Victoria the Eternal. The single most valuable and important being in 400 star systems. Lisa couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Her training had covered diplomatic incidents, hostage situations, even first contact scenarios. But nobody had prepared her for this. For finding the missing princess being treated like a pet by a barber who apparently had no idea what he'd stumbled into. Jake looked at her with confusion and mild concern. He could see she was upset about something, but he didn't understand why. Melody stirred at the sound of Lisa's ragged breathing, opening one eye lazily before yawning and showing rows of tiny crystalline teeth. Lisa finally found her voice. It came out as a strangled whisper. She asked Jake if he had any idea what he was holding. If he understood what that creature was. Jake shrugged, saying someone had brought her to him distressed, and he'd been taking care of her since. Her name was Melody. She liked music and warm spots and occasionally set his dish towels on fire, but she was a good girl. The casual way he said it made Lisa's legs nearly give out. She pulled out her communicator with trembling hands and showed Jake the images that had been broadcast across every screen on the station. Official portraits of the heir primaries from the Dragon Empire archives. The opal scales. The crystalline eyes. The distinctive wing pattern. Every single detail matched the dragon currently yawning in Jake's barbershop. Jake's face went pale as he looked between the images and Melody. He started to say something, stopped, then tried again. His mind was racing, trying to process what this meant. The hooded figure who'd brought her. The fact that she'd been terrified and sick with anxiety. Someone had kidnapped the princess. Or maybe rescued her from something. And they'd left her with him, a nobody barber on a random trading station. Lisa was talking rapidly now, words tumbling over each other. She explained about the Empress. About the fleet in orbit. About the deadline that was now less than 10 hours away. About how the Empress had been destroying everything in her path, interrogating people to death, offering impossible rewards. All for this dragon. For Melody. Jake needed to come with her right now. Immediately. They had to get Melody to the flagship before the deadline expired. Before the Empress decided that Tertius 9 had failed her and needed to be made an example of. 40 million people were counting on them. There was no time to waste. Jake stood up, ready to cooperate. He understood the stakes now. Understood that this was so much bigger than him. He reached for Melody to wake her, to explain that they needed to go somewhere. But the moment his hand touched her scales, everything went wrong. Melody woke up fully and immediately sensed Lisa's fear. Dragons, even baby ones, could smell emotions like humans smelled food. And Lisa's fear was overwhelming, flooding the small shop with the scent of pure terror. To Melody's young mind, this strange woman was a threat. A danger to Jake, the person who'd kept her safe and calm and fed when she'd been abandoned and scared. The protective shield that had been surrounding the barbershop suddenly surged inward, concentrating into a visible shimmer around Melody herself. The air crackled with energy. The lights flickered. The walls groaned under sudden pressure. Lisa was thrown backward, hitting the door frame hard. Jake's guitar fell from his hands as the floor beneath him started to crack. Melody was making a sound Jake had never heard before, something between a growl and a roar, but scaled down to her size. It was still loud enough to hurt his ears. Her scales were glowing now, bright enough to cast shadows. Little arcs of rainbow energy danced across her body. She positioned herself between Jake and Lisa, wings spread in a defensive posture, ready to protect the one person in the universe who'd shown her kindness. Jake's instincts kicked in. He didn't think, didn't plan. He just dropped to his knees and started singing. No guitar, no preparation, just his voice doing the lullaby his grandmother used to sing. The one he'd played for Melody that very first night. His voice cracked on the first few notes, rough with fear and adrenaline, but he kept going. The effect wasn't instant this time. Melody was too worked up, too focused on the perceived threat. But Jake kept singing, kept his voice gentle and steady and calm. He sang about sunshine and safe places and being loved. He sang until his throat hurt and his voice went hoarse. Slowly, painfully slowly, Melody's aggressive posture relaxed. The glow faded from her scales. The energy crackling around her dissipated. She turned her head to look at Jake, those big crystalline eyes confused and conflicted. He kept singing, kept his body language open and non-threatening. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Melody settled down. The shield collapsed. The pressure released. She walked over to Jake and pressed her head against his chest, making soft apologetic sounds. Lisa was still on the floor, breathing hard, staring at them both with wide eyes. She'd just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. A human calming an enraged dragonair with nothing but his voice. No technology, no weapons, just music and trust. She tried to stand, winced at the pain in her back from hitting the doorframe, and tried to approach again. But the moment she got within a few feet of Jake and Melody, the dragon tensed up again. The shield started to reform. Lisa froze, understanding dawning on her face. She asked Jake to try moving away from Melody. Just a few steps. Just to test something. Jake did, walking toward the back of his shop. Melody immediately panicked. She started making distressed sounds, and the energy around her spiked dangerously. The floor cracked further. Jake rushed back, and Melody calmed down again. Lisa's face was ashen as she realized what this meant. The air had imprinted on Jake. Bonded with him. It was something from ancient dragon lore, a connection so rare that most modern dragons didn't even believe it was real anymore. It happened maybe once every 1,000 years, when a dragon in distress formed a psychic link with someone who showed them genuine, selfless kindness. Such bonds were considered sacred. Unbreakable. To separate a bonded pair caused psychological damage to the dragon, sometimes permanent. The implications were staggering. They couldn't just take Melody and return her. She wouldn't go without Jake. And if they tried to force it, she might hurt herself or others in her distress. Lisa sat down heavily on Jake's barber chair, mind racing through options. They had to contact the flagship. Had to explain this to the Empress somehow. Had to hope that a mother's love would be stronger than a mother's rage, and that she'd be willing to accept this impossible situation rather than destroy the station in grief and fury. She pulled out her communicator with shaking hands and began composing the most important message of her life, while Jake sat on the floor with a dragon princess in his lap, wondering how his simple life had become so impossibly complicated in less than 2 weeks. The shuttle ride to the flagship was the most terrifying experience of Jake's life, and he'd once survived a reactor breach on a mining station. Melody clung to him the entire time, wrapped around his torso like an oversized backpack, refusing to let go. Lisa sat across from them, constantly checking her communicator and muttering prayers under her breath in at least 3 different languages. The Dragon Empire's flagship was called the Eternal Dominion, and it was bigger than most moons. As their tiny shuttle approached, Jake could see thousands of windows glowing against the dark hull, each one representing entire sections of the ship. Weapons arrays bristled along its surface, each one capable of reducing planets to rubble. This wasn't just a warship. It was a statement of power, a reminder to the galaxy that the Dragon Empire didn't make idle threats. The docking procedure took forever. Multiple security checkpoints, biometric scans, weapons detectors that kept malfunctioning because of Melody's presence. Every guard they passed stared at them with expressions ranging from shock to outright fear. Word had clearly spread that the heir had been found, and that she was being brought in by a human barber who'd somehow managed to bond with royalty. The hallways inside the ship were massive, built to accommodate beings much larger than humans. The ceilings soared overhead, covered in intricate carvings that depicted dragon history going back thousands of years. Jake felt incredibly small walking through these corridors, like an ant navigating a cathedral. Melody seemed unbothered, occasionally chirping at the artwork like she recognized some of the scenes. They walked for what felt like miles before reaching the throne room. The doors alone were 3 stories tall, made of some dark crystal that seemed to absorb light. 2 enormous guards flanked the entrance, dragons in their full form, easily the size of buses. Their eyes tracked Jake's every movement with predatory intensity. One of them growled something in a language Jake's translator couldn't process, and Lisa responded quickly, her voice shaking. The doors opened slowly, revealing a space so vast that Jake couldn't see the far wall. The throne room was designed to inspire awe and terror in equal measure. Pillars of crystallized starlight held up a ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting everything in perfect detail. And at the far end, raised on a platform that required climbing actual stairs to reach, sat the Empress. Empress Victoria the Eternal was magnificent in a way that made Jake's brain struggle to process what he was seeing. She was in her full dragon form, easily the size of a commercial aircraft, with scales that shifted through colors Jake didn't have names for. Her wings were folded against her back, each one inscribed with glowing patterns that seemed to pulse with power. Her eyes were ancient and intelligent and currently burning with barely controlled fury. The temperature in the room dropped as they approached. Jake could see his breath fogging in front of his face. Melody whimpered and pressed closer against him, and he instinctively put a protective arm around her, humming softly under his breath. The small gesture didn't go unnoticed. The Empress's eyes narrowed, focusing entirely on Jake with an intensity that made his knees want to buckle. Lisa had coached him on protocol during the shuttle ride. He was supposed to bow, to use proper titles, to show appropriate deference. But when Jake opened his mouth, all of that flew out of his head. He was just a guy who'd been taking care of a scared baby, and now he was standing in front of that baby's terrifying mother. The Empress spoke, and her voice resonated through the chamber like rolling thunder. She demanded to know who he was. What he'd done to her daughter. Why her child bore his scent so strongly that it was visible even to non-dragons. Her words carried the weight of 3,000 years of rule, of power that could reshape solar systems. Each syllable was a barely veiled threat. Jake swallowed hard and answered honestly. He explained about the hooded figure bringing Melody to his shop. About how she'd been shaking and terrified and wouldn't eat or sleep. About how he just played his guitar because he didn't know what else to do, and it had helped. About taking care of her for 2 weeks because nobody came back for her, and he couldn't just abandon a baby who needed help. He didn't try to make himself sound heroic or special. He didn't try to manipulate or impress. He just told the truth in simple words, the same way he'd explained to any worried parent what had happened while their kid was in his care. When he finished, silence fell over the throne room. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. The Empress stared at him for a long moment. Then she demanded that he release her daughter. Immediately. Her tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Jake looked down at Melody, who was trembling again, pressed against his chest. He gently tried to unwrap her from around his torso, but she made a distressed sound and clung tighter. Her claws dug into his shirt hard enough to draw blood. Jake tried again, speaking softly to her, explaining that her mother was here and everything would be okay now. Melody just whimpered and refused to let go. The protective shimmer started forming around both of them. The Empress saw this and her expression shifted from fury to something more complex. Confusion. Disbelief. And then, as understanding dawned, something that might have been awe. She shifted forms then, shrinking down to something roughly human-sized, though still clearly draconic. It was apparently less threatening this way. She approached slowly, each step measured and careful. When she got close, Melody finally looked up, made a happy chirping sound, and reached out with one small claw. Mother and daughter touched, and the Empress's entire demeanor changed. The rage that had been radiating from her melted away, replaced by relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. But when the Empress tried to take Melody from Jake's arms, the baby panicked. She scrambled back against Jake, making those distressed sounds again, and the shield flared bright enough to make everyone in the room flinch. The Empress pulled back immediately, and Melody calmed down. She tried again with the same result. Melody wanted her mother close, but she wouldn't leave Jake. The bond was too strong, too new, too absolute. The Empress's face went through a series of expressions. Frustration. Anger. And then resignation. She asked Jake if he understood what had happened. If he knew what a true bond meant in dragon culture. Jake admitted he didn't, not really. Lisa had tried to explain in the shuttle, but it hadn't made much sense to him. The Empress explained in simple terms. Her daughter had chosen him. Had formed a psychic connection that happened once in a millennium, maybe less. Such bonds were mentioned in their oldest texts, considered sacred gifts from whatever forces shaped the universe. They couldn't be broken without causing severe psychological damage. They couldn't be ignored or dismissed. They simply were, absolute and eternal. She could force Melody away from him. She had the power to do it. But it would hurt her daughter, possibly permanently. It would damage the child's ability to trust, to love, to form connections. It would turn her into something cold and broken. And the Empress, for all her power and rage, was still a mother. She wouldn't hurt her own child, not even to reclaim her completely. The Empress's next words shocked everyone in the throne room. She declared that Jake Turner would become Melody's companion guardian, an ancient position that hadn't existed in practical terms for over 2,000 years. He would be given estates on the imperial homeworld, wealth beyond measure, titles and honors, everything befitting someone bonded to royalty. He would be part of the royal household, protected by imperial law, answerable only to the Empress herself and her heir. Jake listened to all of this, and then he did something that made Lisa nearly faint on the spot. He said no. Not to the responsibility, but to everything else. He didn't want estates or wealth or titles. He just wanted his barbershop. His guitar. His simple life. He'd take care of Melody, would make sure she was happy and healthy and safe. But he wasn't going to pretend to be something he wasn't. He wasn't a noble or a diplomat or whatever companion guardians were supposed to be. He was a barber who played guitar. That was enough for him, and if it wasn't enough for the Empress, then they had a problem. The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody spoke to the Empress this way. Nobody refused imperial gifts. Nobody negotiated with the most powerful being in 400 systems like they were discussing the terms of a haircut appointment. Lisa looked like she was going to pass out. The guards along the walls tensed, ready to intervene. But the Empress just stared at Jake with an expression he couldn't read. Then, impossibly, she laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh or a mocking one. It was genuine amusement, the sound of someone encountering something they'd never experienced before. She said that her daughter had chosen well. That anyone who valued simple honest work over power and wealth was rare enough to be precious. They negotiated. The Empress would provide resources to expand Jake's barbershop, make it suitable for times when Melody visited. Jake would bring Melody back to the imperial homeworld regularly so she could learn about her heritage and duties. They'd work out a schedule, a compromise that let Melody be both a princess and a kid who just wanted to hang out with the person who made her feel safe. It wasn't traditional. It wasn't even particularly sensible. But it was honest, and both Jake and the Empress seemed to respect that. When they finally left the flagship hours later, Jake was exhausted and overwhelmed and still not entirely sure what had just happened. Melody was asleep in his arms, content and peaceful. Lisa walked beside them in stunned silence, probably calculating how to explain all of this in her official report. Back on Tertius 9, word spread quickly. The barber with the dragon had saved them all. had stood before the Empress and lived. Had somehow negotiated a deal that nobody thought was possible. Jake's shop became legendary overnight. People came from across the sector just to see the place where a human had bonded with royalty, where simple kindness had prevented a war. But Jake just went back to cutting hair and playing guitar, with Melody watching from her favorite sunny spot, occasionally humming along. Because at the end of the day, that was all he'd ever wanted. A simple life, honest work, and someone to share music with. The fact that someone happened to be a dragon princess was just a detail. An important detail, sure, but just a detail nonetheless.